I'm going to start sharing my slides.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Chicago Wilderness Cafe. We're going to give it a few more minutes while folks join us. Welcome. My name is Laura Riley. I'm the coordinator of Chicago Wilderness, and we're here today for the Inflation Reduction Act, Climate Opportunities. What do we know so far? I wanted to let you know that you'll be muted, and please feel free to keep yourself on mute, and you can keep your cameras on or off. We will have time at the end of all of our presentations for Q&A. So save your questions. You can feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll monitor the chat that way and make sure that we remember to ask them at the end. So if that's helpful to you, feel free to use the chat. We're going to give it just a little bit longer while folks join us, but thank you for being here today. All right. Let's give it just a few more minutes. We have a great turnout today, about 125 people registered, so we're not even halfway there yet. Let's just give it a few more minutes. But thank you for being here. Okay, with that, I want to introduce Alicia Sanchez from the Nature Conservancy of Illinois. And Alicia, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Alicia. I work with the Nature Conservancy Illinois chapter. I'm their government relations associate, handling their federal policy portfolio. But here with Chicago Wilderness, I also co-lead the government relations committee, as well as the climate team advocacy subgoal. Thanks again for taking the time this afternoon. Here we have a wide variety of partners with different backgrounds on the line. So to kick things off, I'm going to start with a poll to gauge where the group's at in their knowledge of the Inflation Reduction Act. At that point, I will then hand it over to Ted Hafner, our Chicago Wilderness Climate Goal Lead, to set the stage on how this bill is relevant to the Chicago Wilderness Climate Objectives and Green Vision. Rounding out presenters today is Mike Brunk, the Urban and Community Forestry Program Administrator at the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. With that, Laura, are we ready to initiate the poll? All right, it should be popping up on your screens here. And we will be able to see everyone else's answers in real time. So I'm just going to give it a few minutes for the answers to start trickling in. The first question is, how familiar are you with the climate and clean energy provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act? It seems as though we're getting a lot of moderate level of knowledge here, which is great. This is what we're here for. Second question is, does your organization have experience in leveraging public funding? We have a lot of yeses here, which is great, and we'll love to hear more about that in the discussion and Q&A portion later on here. Finally, is your organization exploring utilizing some of the newfound resources of the Inflation Reduction Act? Happy to see a lot are thinking about it. We're not sure. We have a couple folks who are not affiliated with an organization. Not many no's here, for not any no's in the last question. So I love to see that. And we are at about 87% participation here. So I think we can pause there. That is great. This just gives a really helpful snapshot of where partners are at and the familiarity with the different titles and provisions. So during this call, we hope to provide some information that will help our partners navigate the nuances of this bill by identifying what's relevant in the world of environmental advocacy and conservation. We will also be highlighting and reviewing some of the already available online resources, pinpointing what additional details are necessary to engage in the implementation process. So I'm going to end the poll right here. And then before we get into the meat of it, Laura, I think you wanted to say a few words about our sponsors here.
Yes, I wanted to thank the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Urban and Community Forestry Program and the U.S. Forest Service. Their funding has supported workshops and trainings such as the Chicago Wilderness Jedi series, as well as this cafe here today. These fundings are so important because Chicago Wilderness can help communities improve urban tree canopy and forests across the region, including by participating in the Tree City USA program. These institutions are an equal opportunity provider, and we're really grateful for the opportunity to have Mike Brunk here today to talk to us further.
Thank you, Laura. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Ted to talk about how this ties together with the Chicago Wilderness's larger green vision and climate goals.
Hey there, thanks Alicia, thanks Laura, Mike, and everybody here today. Good afternoon. This is a quick opening slide just for context about CW, what we do. A lot of you are probably aware of this right now because you've seen it multiple times on any cafe that I've been on and presenting, but others as well. So you can see down in the lower left, that's the Chicago Wilderness region. It comprises parts of 4 states, northwestern Michigan, northern Indiana, northeastern Illinois, and southeastern Wisconsin. We are a member organization of about 250, 280, somewhere in there, organizations that come together around conservation and now this new reimagined green vision. As part of this new reimagined green vision, we have been tasked with a number of goal-making exercises, and I'm going to relate to that to you today. Go ahead, Alicia. Thank you. But I'm going to do that through our climate lens. So what are the Green Vision goal teams? They're on the left here. We have a green infrastructure team. We have a conserving land for biodiversity team, increasing equitable access to nature team. Our team is taking climate action. There's a water team to protect healthy water and advocate for healthy water in our riverway system, managing healthy landscapes, and then growing with agriculture team as well. And this is all sort of bundled together by this thing we call the hub, which is our GIS platform. And an example of this is on the right. This is our basic climate slide that we start out with. So you can see the counties that are included in our region, as well as some of the mapping efforts to date. Obviously, there's some gaps, which we're working on, but the hub team, which is based out of the field, has been really doing a bang up job on this work for all of the goal teams. And it's really neat to see this work come together. In relationship, go ahead, Alicia. In relationship to the goals, I can't stress enough that when we created these goals 2 years ago, we were actually envisioning a day like today, where we would be talking about policies that were passed towards climate action. And so in the hopes that this legislation would be more comprehensive than it is, though it's a good start, we were very comprehensive in our goals too. And some of this comprehensiveness is shown by this slide here. The basics are, this was signed a couple weeks ago by President Biden. It is approximately $370 billion in climate and clean energy investments. The bill has a lot to it. It's not just climate based. I'll get into that in a second. And it's due to roll out in phases over the next 10 years. We have many areas of interest. My big takeaway from this slide, other than basics, is the two images on the right, which show that really, even though it's a great, fantastic start, and I can't emphasize that enough, it is not enough. And you can sort of see that by the size of the iceberg below the water level, as indicated in the top graphic, and in the bar chart in the bottom graphic, showing that we really need something like 3 to 4 trillion, of which this is a few 4 billion, right? So we have a long way to go, but like I said, it's a great start. Next slide, please, Alicia. All right, so what does this bill cover? If you read it, it's 750 pages. It goes through the next 10, 12 years. The first third of the bill is prescription drug pricing, not really climate related. So if you're gonna read the bill, just know that the first 250 pages are about that. The next half of the bill is tax incentives and credits for renewables, EVs and in EV infrastructure, as well as hydrogen, carbon capture, and that kind of thing. I can't stress that this is kind of hard to read. It just inserts places that relates to other bills, and you don't have that context in the bill, but it mostly deals with IRS protocols and procedures and funding. So know that if you're going to sit down and read the bill, which I do recommend because it really is enlightening. The remainder of the bill is mostly what we're interested in, and that's its incentives for nature-based solutions, community-related resilience, environmental justice initiatives, technical assistance, and direct indirect grants. So some of the high-level takeaways, the good credits for wind and solar, and increased tax credits now for people that create these things, and above baseline credits for work in environmental justice communities or associated with environmental justice communities. The mixed part is there's a big provision for nuclear, which is sort of a little dicey for some people. Same with carbon capture, and same with biofuels, because they are still technically a fuel. Even though they are bio-based, they still have percentages of emissions-based fuels. What's interesting in here is there's a lot of talk about hydrogen fuels, aviation fuels, and then there's a lot of this phrase sprinkled throughout, and it really worries me. And maybe we can toss this out at the end in the Q&A, because I think, Alicia, you'll have more insight on this than I do. But the thing that worries me is many of the funding allocations peppered throughout the bill include the phrase, out of any monies in the treasury not otherwise appropriated. So this makes me fearful that this is going to be like a NACA or a clean air and water, WRDA type stuff that we're actually like fighting forever to get funding, even though the funding mechanism is there. Next slide, please. So where do these all shake out? So let me explain the slide a little bit. On the top, you see the different goal teams. On the bottom, you see our sub goals. So we have sub goals in adaptation, mitigation, justice and community, advocacy, and education. Those are our 5 groups. And then we have 2 or 3 sub goals in each of the groups. For sub-goal, and then the last thing is the key here. So if it has a green check, it meets this legislation, the goal meets this legislation and has aspects of this legislation baked in. If it has an orange squiggly thing, that's a maybe, or portions of it apply, but it's not clear right now because we haven't gone through the rules making process, or the bill isn't clear itself. The last one, and there's only one of them, is that the legislation does not support the CW climate goal, and we only have one of those. I'll get to that in a second. So for adaptation, it's very strong. It supports management plans from our constituency and our members, or anybody really, and proposes that those management plans be a guiding light. So these are things like state plans, natural resource plans, even like local onto 2050 plans. Those are considered as well. So that's a bonus. Priority species and adaptation strategies are in there. So that's a bonus that will work well with the 30 by 30 initiatives and support that stuff. And then the community partnerships towards adaptation is really baked in there. That's a high point of this legislation. Member footprints aren't in there. That's sort of our own thing, but they sort of are because they're asking us to do this, but we're not the target audience for this. So that's why I didn't include that. We have our own nature-based mitigation in there. That's in the bill, nature for nature's sake, right? And mitigation's sake. And then renewable siting and planning, I actually didn't think was in there, but Alicia pointed out that there is some really good language in this bill on brownfields and brownfield siting for wind and solar particularly, and that could be a boon to us here in this region. There's certainly a lot of talk about amplifying voices in the bill and partnering with community groups. That's a focus of ours for sure. And then prioritize member-led inequities. That's a big value for us as well. So then we get to advocacy. There's certainly rooms for advocacy throughout this bill. We're going to have to fight for everything, especially given the lack of funding that I talked about. It's provided, but it may not be in there, right? So there'll be a big push on that. And then support local and global goals. We certainly have that in our goal. We point to the Paris Agreement, as well as other UN and other goals as well. And then finally, for education, there's certainly monies and programs for training and resources and community engagement to do stuff like that. And this cafe could be part of that, even though we're not under that. But if this were a formal sort of grant application, we could use that as part of this effort. I think that's about it. Alicia, do I have another slide? I don't think I do.
That goes back to me.
Okay, so that's back to you. Thanks, and hope that overview, that high level overview about how that touches our goal helps shape this conversation. And take it away, Alicia. Thank you.
Right. So before I jump into the various provisions and titles, it's important for me to reiterate that this is a hefty piece of legislation with hundreds of pages of new funding. So even the experts who had a direct hand in crafting this package are still waiting to learn more about further details regarding the rollout of these programs. And same goes for the agencies who are charged with administering. So as environmental and conservation professionals, right now, it's important for us to begin sifting through the various provisions to discern what's relevant for our work, but perhaps equally as importantly, the work of our partners beyond the realm of conservation. Although this is a huge victory, bill passage is only one piece of the puzzle, and now comes the implementation phase, where we must continue to monitor for upcoming opportunities to ensure that the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act is implemented in a way that is in alignment with the original intent of the bill and maximizes climate action progress. Unfortunately, as the weeks go by, there are several great online resources and summaries that outline the subsections of the bill and provide a good overview, and more are coming out every day. We will be circulating this slideshow and linking to online summaries in a follow-up email after the presentation. So let's first jump into some of the air quality and emissions reductions investments. Although some of these funding streams will most directly impact the private sector, they're still critically important for collective greenhouse gas emissions reductions efforts and are likely to pop up within our external partners' work. We were especially heartened by the inclusion of a methane reductions program. So that's 1.5 billion funneled through the EPA to help the oil and gas sector reduce methane emissions through technical assistance to improve overall greenhouse gas reporting, and also introducing methane reducing equipment and processes. Advocates weren't sure if a methane reductions program would be included in final bill text, so this is a significant win here. I personally am excited by the $5 billion for climate pollution plans. This will help encourage an all of government comprehensive approach to addressing climate change. And this program will be in the form of competitive grants to states, territories, tribes, and municipalities to develop and implement greenhouse gas emission reductions plans that make sense from that local perspective. So those who design programs, policies, and measures to reduce emissions will be eligible for grant funding to help them carry out these plans. For these reasons, we anticipate that this program will be particularly applicable to our goals and is something to keep an eye on for additional information. The last two here are relevant to the transportation sector. So we have $3 billion to reduce air pollution at ports, and that's especially important to reduce strain on communities adjacent to these industrial corridors. This goes hand in hand with the final bullet point, and transitioning the transportation sector to renewables as well, such as the $1 billion to transition to zero emitting medium and heavy duty vehicles. These titles play off the momentum of the fall 2021 infrastructure bill, leaving room for previously unforeseen innovation throughout the transportation space. The second group of titles I want to highlight are those that directly address the disproportionate impact climate change and air pollution has had on specific communities. Although this bill is a first step, there's still so much more work that needs to be done to ensure that implementation promotes equity and defers to local leadership, and that we minimize further negative impacts on these communities. That's why it's critical that we acquaint ourselves with these programs and titles sooner rather than later, so that we can leverage our collective influence to advocate for justice and inclusion early on in the rollout process. So one thing I wanted to flag here was the climate and justice block grants. These were funded at $3 billion, and they invest in community-led projects such as community capacity building centers to directly address that disproportionate environmental and public health harms caused by pollution and climate change. We also have $476 million for air quality monitoring. This will be incredibly important to update our aging air pollution monitoring network, investments in new monitoring systems that will just simply better detect these toxins. These grants will help schools, states, and businesses address air quality issues and invest in cleaner fuels and technologies. It will also support the reclamation and destruction of HFCs, which is a climate super pollutant found in refrigerants and coolants that's essentially a super powerful greenhouse gas emission. Then we also have $33 million via the Council on Environmental Quality for environmental justice mapping. This will help track data and collect data to track that disproportionate burden of pollution on certain communities. Sufficient mapping is critical to provide the scientific basis as to why specific communities need to be prioritized when it comes to these climate and clean energy investments in front of the line for the associated jobs and economic benefits that will come from these investments, which I will get into a bit more further on. So while these last two slides are by no means a comprehensive view of the $370 of climate investments and clean energy investments, we tried to center on programs that seem most likely to impact our projects and the work of our direct partners. Next, we have the agriculture provisions, which was another huge win, especially relevant for the Midwest and Chicago wilderness region. Especially in the Midwest, we need to make sure that these resources officially touch down in the agriculture sector and cultivate additional collaboration with agricultures and forestry producers. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we saw nearly $20 billion in funding that will support farmers in enacting climate conscious practices. Particularly, many of the programs in the bullets below are farm bill programs that are routinely oversubscribed. With this new funding, the USDA and NRCS will be able to provide increased technical and financial assistance and incentives to producers who want to explore practices like cover crops, improve nutrient management, or prescribed grazing, just to name a few. Moving forward, we also need to keep in mind how to ensure that there are sufficient agency resources to successfully roll out these programs and how to collaborate and partner with rural communities to engage them on these opportunities. NGOs and nonprofits in particular can act as a convener in this space. Going off of that theme, I'm going to now pass it to Mike Brunk, who is the Urban and Community Forestry Program Administrator for the IDNR, to talk more about some of those forestry opportunities and how we can explore how to best partner with agencies. Oh, I think you're on mute, Mike. There we go.
I told myself not to do that. Thank you. So I manage the Urban Community Forestry Program for the state of Illinois. I came from the municipal sector after a 34-year career as managing urban forestry for the city of Urbana. And so we have in this act, let me step back and reiterate that I have not dove deeply into this act. Our division is still swimming through the bilateral infrastructure law. So I'm really coming to you today just to share some of my experience in past grants and to maybe provide some insight to get your creative juices thinking. But there's 1.5 billion coming through the U.S. Forest Service Urban and Community Forestry Program. That's a big chunk of change. It's coming in the form of competitive multi-year grants, which will probably be a 3 to 5 year duration, to state agencies, local governments, tribes, and nonprofits for tree plantings and related activities, which to me means improving urban forest related efforts with a priority to assist underserved communities. Non-federal cost share requirements, which are typically a 1-to-1 match, may be waived. And that's all we know at this point. The duration for these urban and community forestry funds is federal fiscal year 2022 through federal fiscal year 2031. So that's 9 years. Federal fiscal years start October 1st and end September 30th. This all translates into $166.6 million a year over 9 years, on top of the 40 plus or minus million that the Urban and Community Forestry Program already gets nationally. The overall gist of the Urban and Community Forestry Programming is to build urban forest capacity in local governments. So through our counties and townships and communities. Next slide, please. So what are our discerning next steps? Well, you should recognize, as Alicia alluded to, many agencies are still analyzing this bill. This is a monster bill, and there's a lot to dive into. And it came from the White House. This was not developed at the U.S. Forest Service level. And so we are going to be swimming through it probably as we're enacting it. Also understand there are capacity constraints. Recognize U.S. and states have staff constraints, but also understand this may mean some things like the grants that are going to be coming our way are going to be larger than what we're used to, have higher caps. That's just a guess on my end. Leveraging partnerships, I think, are going to be an advantage. So many entities working through a lead is a good idea, I think, or something to at least consider. And for example, Illinois' Urban Community Forestry Program is a staff of one, it's myself, that leans heavily on partnerships. Disseminating our program through partners exponentially increases our outreach. And I think this could be a good strategy for applicants to consider for these new funds. In other words, think how to magnify program impact. Think pyramid effect. Applicant entities have sub-partners, which in turn have partners, with a result that maximizes the number of communities and townships being touched by program deliverables. So if you think of capacity constraints on the upper end of these things, the U.S. Forest Service and the states, and you imagine a comparative of 100 tree planting grants coming our way versus one applicant who has 10 partners that are managing 10 different tree planting grants. The advantage there, I would think, would be the one applicant that is partnering to supply us with those 100 tree planting grants. So just food for thought. Also think about building outreach to forest preserve communities and townships through education, leadership, guidance, and resources. And why I say that is because, in my opinion, Illinois forest preserves many times are the recognized urban forest of a community, and as such are the local authority on tree planting care and management, especially in communities and townships where that expertise does not exist. These communities enact public tree care they gain from their forest preserve professionals. These new funds can be an opportunity to enhance forest preserve leadership among these communities and in turn help build urban forest capacity. So for those interested in community engagement, it is a good time to start thinking about how community engagement can both meet your missions, state priorities, and brainstorm about outside the box ideas and partnerships. Note, priority will be given to programming that assists underserved communities. So think macro scale, community outreach, know that these grants will be about a 3 to 5 year duration, and think multiple grant opportunities. Think large regional type community programs. Think partnerships and sub-partnering. Think program establishment and long-term gains. Think big results. How many communities and townships can ultimately be touched? Think multiple proposals or bundled packages. And I'll leave you with this. Probably a good idea to review the Illinois Forest Action Plan, which we've provided on the slide here, a link to. Specifically for the urban and community forestry funds, the Illinois Urban Forest Strategies on page 59 through 67, because that will give you some program or project direction. It is my guess that it will be required for these grants to follow suit with the Illinois Forest Action Plan strategy, urban community forestry plan strategies and guidelines. And that is all I have, Alicia.
Thank you, Mike. It's very valuable to hear the quote unquote insider perspective from a state agency representative. Piggybacking off of what Mike was saying, there are still obvious gaps in information regarding how the rollout process will play out. We all still have some foundational questions regarding eligibility requirements for these grants, timing of application cycles, and additional reporting and cost share requirements, just to name a few. Even though nonprofits and NGOs may not be direct recipients of some of these buckets, it's important to still familiarize ourselves with these programs so that we can continue to leverage our influence and insert the associated climate action and titles provisions all progress at the scale that we need. Each and every day, key agencies are releasing additional details on IRA implementation. So I've compiled some hyperlinks below, which will be circulated over email. These provide a great overview of what we know so far and will be helpful in discerning priority areas to monitor. This is really the first step that we need to focus on right now in order to efficiently engage in the larger implementation process and make sure that we're fully taking advantage of those cross-cutting opportunities. So I wanted to end the presentation portion on a positive note and contextualize the economic and job creation benefits that are projected to come from this bill. So the Nature Conservancy commissioned BW Research to conduct a study identifying the estimated economic impacts of the climate policies included in the Inflation Reduction Act. We modeled about $357 billion worth of investments and incentives that promote clean energy and energy efficiency across sectors, support sustainable agriculture and forestry, and provide for safer and healthier communities. The report highlights the specific economic impacts of these policies over the next decade through value added, earnings, tax revenues, and employment by industry and occupation. The full report is available online, which we will also be circulating after. It was projected that nationally, the investments of this bill would support 537,000 jobs annually for the next 10 years. And for every $1 of federal investments in the bill, we will generate a return of $1.42 in economic output. So in addition to the national results, we focused on 12 states across the country to provide a closer look at how local impacts will touch down. In the Chicago Wilderness region, we also produced metrics for Illinois, which you will see in the center of the screen. So these are incredibly exciting numbers. This analysis shows that through the Inflation Reduction Act, we have the chance to not only take breakthrough climate action, but also open new pathways to job creation for a new generation of workers. In order to make these numbers and these benefits a reality, we must ready ourselves now to engage in the implementation process. Even though the bill has passed, the window of opportunity to influence these buckets and how they're applied is still very much open. So above all, Chicago Wilderness wants to be an ally and an asset in helping partners navigating this space. So to further identify where we can be of help, I'd like to kick off the discussion portion of this webinar with a Menti exercise. So for those who are not familiar, excuse me, I'm just going to share my screen here. Menti is an online survey platform that allows for participants, It allows for participants in these types of calls to give feedback in a way that we can all monitor each other's input in real time. So you should all see my screen share right here. If you could go to menti.com, that is MENTI.com. You can do it on either your smartphone or open another tab on your browser right here and type in the code farther to the right. You should be able to begin inputting answers on the screen here. I'm going to give everyone a few moments to log on. All right, so we have one individual on already. Great, we have some answers starting to trickle in here to the first question. How can Chicago Wilderness be most helpful in educating partners about these similar public funding opportunities? Webinars, email updates. As nonprofits, is there anything we can benefit from the new tax credits for electric cars and trucks? I can get into that in a moment. Provide periodic updates. Is there anyone on the call who would like to raise their hand and elaborate on some of these further? And I think I could use some help in monitoring the chat here. If anyone popped in.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any hands raised at the moment.
Laura Dirks.
Laura, yes, please.
Yeah, I just thought, what about smaller, break it down since there's so many members? And I mean, that analysis for Illinois in particular was terrific. It just seems to me that if we could have, smaller trainings and then sort of a train the trainer approach, I don't know if that's feasible.
Do you mean by breaking it down by, so I had one slide for the agriculture titles, perhaps hosting some.
Yeah, I mean, like the specific to the CW goal is, closing the inequities and access to nature and have it, those components, whoever's working on that issue could lead discussions on that.
I agree. I think so. I think Ted has his hand raised.
Yeah, Laura, in response to that, there are a number of things at work right now within the CW Climate Committee. And I was just brainstorming with Alicia before this. We think our next climate committee meeting will sort of take that approach. And we're going to try to advertise it and get as many goal team members there as possible so that we can start to discuss those differences and those splits. But I think you're on the right track here. And I think one of the things that we're thinking about now that this is here is how this falls out in more detail, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome.
Jeff Weiss.
Yeah, hi. What's most helpful to me is email announcements with grant opportunities, identified links to the web page or whatever source there is of information, and in particular, the grant deadline. So I monitor a wide number of grants and that level of information is most helpful and most efficient for me.
Yeah, I want to support that, Jeff, and I'll drop a link in the chat. The Chicago Wilderness Community Calendar actually has an ability to create a searchable calendar for grants and grant deadlines, but I would welcome everyone's support. I'll drop the link in. Everyone can send and submit a calendar alert, and I can enroll that into our calendar so that I make sure that we get it out in front of folks. But thanks, that's a great suggestion. We can do that right now.
Thank you.
I agree. I think that is a very common theme, and we saw it with the infrastructure bill. Just having a comprehensive place, I think, would also be helpful that tracks all of the different deadlines there, as opposed to having to navigate different agency websites and so on and so forth. Laura, I think you raised your hand again, or was from that from the previous time?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that if we have the opportunity to give feedback as the regulatory process is unfolding, having these smaller group, like Ted was talking about, I think would be really great, to be able to continue to provide, since it's still unfolding and many of the provisions people are getting familiar with. So I just advocate also content-based.
And I think that is quite feasible, and especially if we were to bring in the other CW goal leads, as Ted was saying, that would be a huge value add. Before I move on, Ted, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I did quickly. When we were prepping for this, Mike astutely noted that he is just one portion of IDNR, and it would be great to maybe get other folks that have other discipline sort of responsibilities and areas of interest in to see how it might fall in their areas as well. I think that would be in really helpful, because what Mike said pertaining to urban forestry may not apply to others, or they might have their own matching criteria, right? So I think that might be valuable too.
Yeah, and I think we can continue to do this again.
think
Maggie,
next up,
sorry.
Maggie, yes.
Yeah, one of my questions, based on my experience with the soil and water conservation districts is, so we're going to get an increased amount of money, with these programs that we've been utilizing for years. I'm not sure, is there going to be more money for staffing, for increasing staff? Because right now we are just like blown away trying to keep up at the district level.
I think that is largely dependent on the particular funding stream and the discretion that the state agency retains. Ted, I don't want to jump in here. I think you have something you want to say.
Yeah, reading through the bill, Maggie, it depended on the agency and the topic criteria. So obviously for the IRS, there is a lot of funding for staffing, but I did see in many areas that repeat language that the IRS areas used is just broken down by topic. Gosh, maybe we can look at that a little further to see where those opportunities for staff funding lie. But because we wanted to get this out, I wasn't really focusing too carefully on that.
And I think that that's why it's important to continue to lean on those partnerships that we do have with state agencies to figure out which titles and funding streams the states do retain more discretion in how that is used, whether it's for agency capacity or whatnot, and increase staffing and making sure that we are there and engaged in the process from early on to make those recommendations where we can.
So I have one other question regarding the working with local government, particularly municipalities, because they have such an ability to improve natural settings in their by utilizing their budgets, i.e. planting along stream corridors or around detention ponds and park districts. Where in this are we addressing reaching out to local government?
I think the first step there are webinars such as this. I was looking at the registration sheet, and we do have a couple of our attendance from representatives from municipalities there. And so I think that working with them, especially figuring out where we could potentially supplement those educational gaps, but also driving home the message of stacking funding opportunities. So with the infrastructure bill, with the Inflation Reduction Act, we have a lot of great federal resources coming in. At the state level, with passage of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, that's another huge funding stream in this space. And then going down to what you were saying with the annual budgeting and appropriations process with the municipal and local governments, I'm trying to drive home this message of the importance of stacking these opportunities, approaching from that bigger picture cohesive approach so that we are not siloing these opportunities from each other.
Alicia, I have one more addition to that. And I think it goes along the lines of something like, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the bigger initiatives in this, and if you remember back to my slide with the years going through 2034, a lot of this stuff will need to go through rules. So we don't really know how it's going to touch down on municipalities quite yet directly. But I think Mike gave a really good indication of how it might flow down through the states and then through the municipalities. My guess is we'll have more understanding of that in the next year or two, because if you noticed, I placed that sort of IRS credit thing, which is the backbone of all of this, sort of while they begin this year, a lot of this stuff won't really be shaped for a year or two. So I think we need to be a little patient, and I think we need to be proactive in terms of some of this stuff. Does that help answer the question? More
Yeah.
questions from Maggie.
Yeah, yeah, and I get it. I understand this is all just coming to us and we're all just sitting here, you know, trying to figure out how this is going to help our own specific work that we're involved with. One recommendation would be to assist municipalities in understanding how green infrastructure will in fact reduce their annual budgets. You put in functioning detention ponds that will help reduce the cost of blown out bridges and culverts that they have to repair. So, you know, if there's something that I would highly recommend that we get going on, is the economics of it.
And I think that that's a strength. And I think part of this process is looking inwards and looking at the strengths of our individual organizations. And I know for many of us on the call, our strength comes from conducting these types of economic analysis or feasibility studies there, and really digging in, mapping out how this can be actualized on the ground. In a way that perhaps municipalities and local governments do not have the capacity or funding to do so.
Thanks. Janice Hill has her hand raised.
Thanks. I wanted to follow up with Maggie's comment, and that is preparing our municipalities, especially as they go through their upcoming budget cycles, for the benefits of setting aside local dollars to prepare for a match for these federal dollars. I put in the chat earlier about helping us sort through which grants require local match versus no match. And having worked with a lot of federal dollars over the last few years, it's pretty rare to find one that doesn't require a local match, non-federal local match. And so advocating our state legislature, as well as all of our local governments, to understand that the amount of money they put aside for us to use for local match only will determine how much money, federal money, we can bring in. Because chances are good these are all going to require a local non-federal match, and it'll be required to be a certain percentage. And that's something they can prepare for now in their upcoming budgets. But in advance of that, what Maggie said, why that's a good investment for them. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons besides getting a $1-for-$1 match of federal money coming back, but also the long-term benefits of all the work that we do in this sphere. So that's it.
Highlighting those social benefits as well is critical, those tangible and intangible benefits. And that's why we will be circulating the Nature Conservancy and BW research economic analysis, but just socializing those and driving home the message that these benefits do touch down far beyond the realm of environmentalism or conservation.
Hey, Janice, I appreciate your comment, and I also appreciate and noted your chat comment. One of the things that I believe, reading through, if memory serves, that the match is like, I think the government will cover 70 to 75% of the dollars. So the local match will be either 25% or 30%. I hope that helps for now. I don't have much other information than that, but I think it's a good point to start working with a lot of these, especially some of the Metro Mayors Caucus and Green Region Compact groups that have their own climate plan, right? So thank you for that.
Yeah, you know, in the sphere of the work that I specifically do, which is farmland protection, and their ASAP AL is one of the categories in this, that would be a significant change, because right now they require 50%. So if there are changes, I think that's another thing that would be really important to point out as to why local governments and the private sector should take advantage of this. And that I think you almost need an economic analysis to show what benefit do we get, economic benefit, and then the impact beyond that of those federal dollars coming back. And I know other states do it, right? So if you can show for every every dollar that we put in, we're getting a certain match, and then how that circulates through the community, I think that would go a long way to helping local governments understand, and the business community understand, why this is a good investment for them and why they need to start saving for this now.
I think so as well. And like you said, now, sooner rather than later, being anticipatory and proactive is hugely important here. In the interest of time, I am moving us along to our next discussion question. Are there specific IRA grant programs or funding streams your organization has already identified as relevant to your work? I find these answers here to be quite interesting. I see a lot of great thing that we have you on the call today, Mike. A lot of interest in those urban forestry provisions and the community planning ones. I particularly am tracking the community planning funding. For some of them have not yet elaborated on, will nonprofits be eligible? Exactly, some have. I also see some of the climate smart agriculture programs, EQIP. Yes, EQIP is like overprescribed. It's only like 1 out of 7 applications are actually accepted because of a lack of funding. And I think EQIP got about like 8.5 billion in additional funding. So that's quite exciting there, but I want to open up the floor. Does anyone have any funding stream in particular that they'd like to comment on here?
This is Janice again. You know, I mentioned, of course, that the Farmland Protection Program and EQIP are particularly interesting for us. We know we're going to apply for that in Kane County and with our partners. But I would really be curious about the community planning, especially some of that work that can be done in advance of applying for those funds. We already applied for those funds, but really curious about bringing in partners, particularly municipal partners that have not participated in ASAP, that might be interested and need to do community planning first. So I'd like to know a lot more about that.
And I also think that goes back to my earlier point of how can we couple these opportunities together to make just sure that we're approaching in a comprehensive way, because with all these recent funding streams, I do worry that there's a lack of cohesiveness, that in order to maximize these benefits, we'll have to do a lot of our due diligence to get around. One thing that I don't see here, but I also wanted, oh no, it is right there, the EJ mapping. There has been a lot of talk at the federal, state, local level about the need to somehow standardize a definition for environmental justice communities and provide a baseline so that when further climate and clean energy investment legislation and programs do come out in the future, we can pinpoint and prioritize which communities should be at the front of the line for these benefits. I know that many of the organizations on here already have their own versions of EJ mapping systems, so definitely something to continue to monitor there. USDA, yes, those USDA programs, I was quite shocked when I saw the level of funding there. I can't really overstate how important that those will be. Honestly, as I think it was Laura was saying, we could probably have an entire webinar just on some of the USDA investments in here. All right, unless we have any more comments here, I think I'm going to move along to the next question. So I think we've gone over this quite a bit, but I just do want to open up the floor to see if there's anything else here in terms of what additional program details are needed for partners to leverage these new resources. If there's something that you wanted to speak up about but haven't gotten the chance to so far, just want to make sure we're giving everyone that space here. I'll give it a few minutes here. See if we have any other answers trickling in. I feel as though we've identified many of those main gaps in knowledge, such as cost share requirements, eligibility and application requirements, and timing of the cycles and deadlines. So if we're not getting, how this fits with state, and yes, we do need coordination. I'm not sure who submitted that, but I wish, Ted, yes. Thank you, Ted. Do you want to speak about that at all, especially with some of the work that Chicago Wilderness has been doing with the Climate Action Plan and all of that?
Yeah, so right now there are a lot of plans out there. Chicago has just revised one. They also have a comprehensive plan coming up that will address a lot of these issues. Like I said earlier, the Greenest Region Compact Group has their own climate plan that came out about a year ago. It's really forward thinking and really nice, but that's sort of a regional plan. It's 280 municipalities, I think, plus or minus in the Chicago area. But I'm noticing that there's not a whole lot of forming together to see where these synergies lie and to see where the opportunities lie. And I'm getting kind of worried that there, Illinois has made a lot of, we've set the stage well, but we're not taking advantage of setting that stage because I don't see the coordination and how these fall down. And how we all work together and not compete against one another to do this work. So I would love to see more coordination. I think maybe this can be the vehicle to do that. That's what I meant there.
Right. I thank you for those comments, Ted. It seems like, not to sound like a cynic, but it seems like every week, every month, there's some sort of new local comprehensive plan or initiative. And then we spend all this time commenting on it, making sure our priorities are included, but then also making sure that there's actual measurable accountability metrics that go along with these plans and incorporating and referring back to these funding streams in the cultivation of these plans. I see another question. Do you picture this funding going towards already established programs or looking to be seed money for new programs? This probably won't be a very satisfactory answer, but I have seen a mix of the two there. So for example, with the agriculture, the climate smart agriculture funding, though many of those were already existing Farm Bill programs. However, with some of the climate greenhouse gas emission reductions community planning, those are new programs. And I feel as though, especially in those, that's where we need to be mindful and be on it and influencing in the rollout process, because the next couple of years of these new programs will set a precedent for how similar programs are approached in the future. How do we reach out to organizations not typically considered environmentalists? Well, I think that that goes back to another question earlier that I saw, like how do some of the tax credit touch down in the NGO space? I know that many of us have corporate partnerships. I think that this bill will add new value to having those types of corporate partnerships more so than ever before. And I think it's going back to those partnerships is how we can make sure that people beyond the realm of conservation are engaged in this space. I am interested to see if anyone else on the call would have opinions about this, because I feel like this is a consistent question here. How do we ensure that we're talking to the people who we actually need to talk to, as opposed to preaching to the choir, preaching to the people who will already do the right thing? Any other comments there? I'm just rolling.
Mike, I saw your hand go up real quick. I think maybe to the prior box, but if you want to go ahead, go ahead.
Either or, yes, please.
I was just going to add, I was typing it in. For the urban and community forestry program, the funding goes towards both established programs and two established programs. So it's all of the above. I think it's important to think outside the box. This is a large amount of money that's coming our way, and let's not get tied into thinking about our own backyard. This is an opportunity to really think outside the box and think big picture. In urban and community forestry, we're trying to build capacity. So we're trying to build communities to be able to care for their urban forests. And there's so many different avenues that can be approached to do that. So that's my 2 cents.
We have a hand raised from Laura Dirks.
Yeah, so I just raised this as an example. So nature, culture, and human health is looking at the intersection of equity, public health, and climate change or sustainable and resilient communities. And so it's really caused us to think outside the choir. So, many of the people on the call do participate in the monthly tree equity project that the Chicago Department of Public Health is spearheading, but many of the public health voices, for example, haven't really thought about climate change and haven't thought about the impact of nature on health. And it's really, I think it would be great to have a brainstorming session about, and I think about the first Chicago, the Wilderness CW Congress I went to where the Beyond the Choir conversations were happening. I think this really speaks to, who is in the Beyond the Choir community-based groups that we can really try, especially if there's potential funding resources, and just talking about how community resiliency, which would affect really everyone, it's an opportunity to work together.
Yes, I think so. That intersectional cross-sector partnerships will be incredibly important there, Laura, especially with your role on the NCH2. Am I saying that right? NCH2. Those are the types of community connections that will really have to amplify and put a lot of attention and investment to continuing to cultivate those to make sure that this is implemented in alignment with the true intention of the bill. There's a lot of opportunity here, but also a lot of responsibility. So at this point, we are at the top of the hour. I was hoping to, just being respectful of everyone's time, to wrap this up around this time. I do want to leave it open though, give another chance for any additional questions or comments.
Alicia, one other thing, I talked to Lydia about this, and then she had her presentation last week about the nature-based mitigation solutions, because the last climate action where we had different people present their plans, the forest preserves, and the discussion was that right now they're not using current nature assets for carbon mitigation and so I happened to ask her, to present what they're working on. And I think it would be an interesting, bigger discussion for CW to talk about, is CRTI the only group that's looking at nature-based solutions and the actual measurability of them? I would love to learn more about it.
Yes, I think that would be excellent. I've been taking notes, scribbling away furiously here. Going back to nature-based solutions, especially with the fall 2021 infrastructure bill, that provided a lot of forward momentum in recognizing nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure as a viable solution to these types of problems. In the infrastructure bill, that was, I think it was the first definition of natural infrastructure being officially included in federal legislation. So there's already been a lot of momentum in that space. And I think that the Inflation Reduction Act just gives new opportunity to bring those two together there. Is there anyone else? going once, going twice. I finally have unshared my screen so I can see everyone. Well, once again, I just really wanted to thank everyone, our two presenters, Mike and Ted. Your level setting was so incredibly helpful here. Thank you to everyone for taking the time and just for such an engaging discussion. It's really helpful for us and recognizing what we can do to be more of a help to you. Last thing I wanted to say was that we have a couple of summaries and one-pagers on this bill that are a bit more topic specific to Laura Dirk's point, I think it was, about wanting to dive in a bit deeper to the different subject matter areas around here. We will be circulating this as well as the recording and slideshow presentation in an email shortly after. So Laura, unless you had any additional closing comments, I think I will leave it at that and say thank you to you all for participating again today. Thank you. All right, bye everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.